Hello, my name is Malli Kini. I'm a tax partner and the lead for entrepreneurs here at Blick Rothenberg. I'm really pleased to be having a wide discussion today on the tax changes that were introduced in the October budget last year and how it impacts business owners and their businesses. I'm joined today by my two esteemed guests who are highly respected individuals in their respected fields and are regularly quoted within mainstream media. My first guest is Steve Rigby, who is the co-CEO of Rigby Group PLC, which is one of the largest family businesses in the UK and in the top 500 family businesses in the world. Steve is also due to become the chair for Family Business UK. My second guest is Nimesh Shah, who is a senior tax partner and CEO of Blick Rothenberg. Steve, Nimesh, thank you so much for joining today. If I could just set the scene. So Rachel Reeves and Labour are quite fixed on sticking to their fiscal rules as well as the Labour manifesto of not taxing working people. So that essentially means that they can't really make many adjustments to income tax, VAT or national insurance, which on reflection with the new rules coming in must have meant employee national insurance, since they are making adjustments to that. Because of these restrictions, they've had to make a raft of tax changes, which has included capital gains tax changes, national insurance, as well as inheritance tax, where they're specifically focusing in on capping business relief. So if I start with that, so for the first question, Steve, Nimesh, what have you seen from an engagement perspective from Labour and Rachel Reeves' office?
I think pre-election, I think she did a great job. Her and Johnny Reynolds clearly put a lot of effort in. Like many, I'm sure I met them in that process, and I walked in with a lot of hope. I thought we really needed change. I thought the Conservatives were unfortunately become disorderly as a party, and they themselves, I think, now realise it was time for a change. So I had a lot of hope. Post coming into power, things changed, and it's interesting how the roles reversed between being in shadow versus in power, and now the Conservatives are very engaged, and I guess they were less so pre. So we've had a normal situation where those in power hold all the cards, think they have all the answers, and therefore don't need to listen quite as much. So there has been quite a seismic shift. That said, I think for a certain number of people, you can still get good engagement. So I personally am still quite well engaged in Treasury and DBT, but I think the trust in business has moved substantially to the left, unfortunately, and the budget did a lot of damage. I think that's going to take a long time to recover from.
And Nimesh, I know from an advisory perspective, and especially in the tax community, we've been trying our best as well. So what have you been seeing?
I think it was a similar experience to Steve, really, that prior to the election, there seemed to be just more engagement between the government bodies, Treasury, HMRC, and seeking input of professional advisors. I think it fell off a cliff immediately after the election. That void between the election and the October budget actually, I think, did more damage than the budget itself because of that speculation about what may or may not happen. But the level of stakeholder engagement, even in that period and just before the budget and even after the budget, was non-existent from my perspective. And some of the big changes that were introduced, you can put national insurance to one side for a moment, because that's a very easy fix in the legislation, just increase the rate. But business property relief, non-dom changes, what they've done with, or what they're about to do with private equity and carried interest, those are big changes to our tax framework, and there has been zero consultation with that. And I think if I go back in my tax career over the last 10, 15 years, the engagement that you would have had and the input that the government, HMRC would have taken from the professional community on the impact of those, the practical impact, but also how the design of some of those policies would work. That's a big change to what's happened now, and these rules are coming in. It's almost this sledgehammer approach where we know kind of why the government wanted to change some of those things, non-DOMs and BPR, APR, but the lack of engagement there and about how we could design those policies, that's been really disappointing from my perspective.
It's very unusual though, isn't it, this lack of engagement? What do you think is driving that?
I really can't put my finger on it. The climate seems to have changed. It seems much more draconian around we are doing this, whether anyone likes it or not. They seem really entrenched in some of the, dare I say it, some of the ideology. I don't like saying that, but it feels like there is a lack of strategy, and there's clearly an agenda about these things do need to happen, but I can't quite put my finger on why.
So I think from Nimesh's side, I think there's been sort of a lack of engagement. I think it was interesting to hear that you said that you still have inroads into Treasury, etc. So do you feel a bit more hopeful that they may listen? Or
I think they're in a difficult spot, unfortunately. I think, after last week's spring statement, unfortunately, Rachel boxed herself in again further. So, to have a non-negotiable phrase used twice in the spring statement in an environment where there is, quite frankly, a very rosy outlook on the economy moving forward, a 1.75% growth for the next 4 years. It's rarely ever been done. And actually the downside scenario, so I would call that in business a best case. The worst case, which was actually in the OBR report, potentially had 100 million deficit in the same fiscal period, 100 billion deficit. So we have these extraordinary levels, and in reality the base case is probably likely to be a position where they're going to need to borrow or tax another 40 or 50 billion. So we're in a difficult spot, and as I say, to use language around non-negotiable, I think it's very strange when you've already had a non-negotiable policy around taxation. 76% of tax is excluded from any changes, leaves a very small number. And in fact, the reason why I was in Treasury pre-budget and post around BPR is I recognise there are only 30 taxes above £1 billion that could have been changed, and BPR was right up there. So we went in ahead of the curve as Family Business UK to actually suggest a number of, if you like, modifications, modernisation of the policy work, because some aspects were probably one-sided. But unfortunately Treasury chose not to listen to that and actually pursued, what is a small amount of tax, 0.5 billion of tax, in an environment where they recruit 1.2 trillion a year. It really is a small number.
Thank you so much. And I think that leads us nicely into the second question, actually. So with all these changes that are due to come in or are coming in, how's that impacted your family business, Steve, like at Rigby Group, and also just the business community at large?
So, we have been in a succession journey for quite some time. It's always challenging, especially when, it's a second generation. The first generation's never been through it. And in that situation, I've been on a transition with my own father and family business for about 10 years. Fortunately, we got to the end of that transition about a year ago. So for us, actually, January 24 was the final transition to trust. So we'd had one transition, but the final shareholding went into trust early. And we did so on the basis of potential change of government. So we were fortunate to be forward thinking. We've been on a long journey. These things take a long time. So for a lot of family businesses, they're not in that position. So whilst there is some impact for us around clearly the legislation around how you're taxed in trust now on BPR, which is going through consultation right now. Strange they consult on that, but not on the broader legislation. So in that situation, we were prepared, but lots of families I talk to are not, and they're in a period now of disbelief, of fear, of panic, and people are now having to think about quite accelerated journeys, often with children who may not be actually active in the business. So in our situation, my brother and I, have been leading the business for 10 years. So for us, it's quite a straightforward journey. But if we were in the situation perhaps where it was our third generation, we have 6 children, the majority of which don't have any involvement in the company. So actually making an accelerated change then is quite a dangerous thing to do, which is why this legislation shouldn't have had anti-forestalling and should have had a position where actually, April next year was sufficient time to plan and structure your affairs. But unfortunately, the government chose to, in effect, bring the legislation in with a rearview mirror.
And I think obviously that with your work at Family Business UK, the research showed that there was quite a lot of businesses who are considering selling.
Yeah, we've just done a piece of work with CBI Economics, who are a very good partner of ours. 4,200 businesses, about 1,600 of which were significantly affected by the changes. And that's clearly showing, reduction in employment. It's showing reduction in investment. It's showing consideration for sale. And unfortunately for the Treasury, it's showing a net 1.9 billion reduction rather than a gross 1.4 from BPR billion gain. So quite a huge swing based on sentiment. And I'm talking as your organisation will be all the time to family businesses. It's real. People are stopping making decisions. People are concerned. People are considering transactions. Great if you're private equity. Bad if you're interested in long-term ownership of some of the best businesses in the UK.
And Nimesh, I know you look after quite a lot of our large accounts here at Blick Rothenberg. So what are you hearing when you're speaking to founders, owners of businesses?
Yeah, I think Steve is in a relatively great position. It's unusual that I see with family businesses to have that level of governance and foresight around that transition. I'm not surprised, Steve, when you say for a business like yours that it would take such a long period of time. A lot of family businesses that you work with, this necessarily isn't right at the top of the agenda. Entrepreneurs, business owners are infallible. They think they're going to live forever. And BPR was one of those reliefs where actually it played into that psychology. I think with the lens on inheritance tax over the last 12 months, it has caused this panic. People made huge knee-jerk reactions even before the autumn budget about speculation about what may or may not happen. Big, large gifts being made for family businesses or even just assets, cash assets, houses. That's not the way to structure your planning. You need a much more methodical approach. So wholly subscribe to what Steve and the family have done here, but that isn't always the reality. And now there is this panic about, well, what do I do? Because I'm facing this cliff edge in April next year, a year from now, where I'm exposed to a significant inheritance tax liability, which I didn't have before. I need to do something. I don't quite know what to do. And the conversations that I suppose we're having with our family business clients around optionality, and some of them are pretty extreme around, actually you've mentioned, Malli, about people like completely selling up. The next generation isn't ready, or there's big age gap there, or they haven't done the succession planning that they should have done, in particular around the operation of the business. But in the real extreme situations, people are taking the step to leave the UK. There's been lots of press stories about millionaires, billionaires leaving the UK. It's not just non-doms. I think that is quite lost in some of the noise that we're seeing in the media. British entrepreneurs, family businesses are looking at leaving the UK. It's a lot easier now than ever before about how you may operate the business outside of the UK. And actually a byproduct of the non-dom rules, which I think all interacts, national insurance, non-doms, private equity, all of this stuff interacts together to create this melting pot of a bit of chaos around what's happening with British entrepreneurship. So leaving the UK and where those businesses then base themselves and where the headquarters are and where the management will be, that again is a big talent drain that's coming out of the UK and is going to hit the UK economy and tax receipts, unfortunately. And I don't think anyone has quite linked all of those things together. It's all done very much in isolation.
I think I couldn't agree more. I think that what we're seeing in practice is absolutely all types of business owners considering leaving the UK, as you said, not just non-doms. And what's quite sad is we're seeing businesses, successful business, who are exiting for the first time, and the first thing on the list is, should I be here in the UK or not when that exit happens? So
I think every entrepreneur, business owner is talking about, should I be leaving?
Yeah.
They may not pull the trigger right now, but it's been on the agenda for every meeting that I've had over the last 12 months.
Yeah.
I think it's a concern. I'm slightly more hopeful that, the reason why people are here, I don't think they're changing. So our time zone, our law, our weather, strangely, a lot of people find attractive. We all try and escape it. Our schooling system. There's a lot of reasons why London remains, the centre really of a lot of people's lives. So I don't think many of those things are changing. And when you've got children at school, everyone I'm talking to in that situation isn't considering leaving, but they're thinking about when they go. But they're not going to leave in the immediacy whilst their children are here. But I think, I was talking to an advisor recently, and she was working on about just under 28 people, and she normally does 2 a year. So I'm not worried about... frankly, all those fleeing to Dubai, that worries me less, if I'm being honest, because I think some of that, I suspect, is transitory, and those things have been happening a long time. But I do worry about the small number, the small hundreds of people who are potentially leaving, who are big philanthropists, who are big business owners, who are genuinely mobile. If you're perhaps in your 50s and your children are older, you generally have more flexibility. We're still offering 90 days. That's still a sizable number of days. Here in the UK, a quarter of your time. So I think it is, it's a shame. And I talk to people who would happily pay £1 million a year fee to stay in the UK. At the end of the day, in Italy, it's 200,000 plus 25k per dependent. So if you've got a family, you're through 300,000 euros, and it's Italy. It's not London. So people would have paid a substantial fee-based, a means-tested fee, of anything from 200,000 to £1 million a year. And that's a real missed opportunity, because we'd have raised more from that process than we would have done through any other means. This is where, unfortunately, the ideological aspect kicks in.
So, there's good ideas that have been thrown out there, Steve. So if I could wave a magic wand and allow you to have full influence over policy, or better still yet, You could be chancellor, basically. So what would you do differently? Obviously, you've got the fiscal rules that currently are in play. You've got the OBR that's also commenting.
Yeah.
Any changes?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think we've got three things we need to do as a country right now. The first is the triple lock. How can we justify paying pensioners the higher of inflation, CPI or average wage rises when we can't do that for our teachers and nurses? It just feels morally wrong. It's about $7 billion a year. It gives us a small amount of additional headroom, but I personally think that's got to be considered. And there's starting to be some calls around that. The second for me is the fiscal rules. I think, as a company, I run lots of covenants in my debt. I couldn't sleep at night with the tightness of covenant that Rachel Reeves has put upon herself on the fiscal rules. So I think we either have to adjust the fiscal rules, which have already been adjusted to remove capital spending. So that takes us from 96% to 83% debt to GDP. We have to watch the cost of debt, it's 105 billion, so it's a big number. But I would change that measure and allow us to have a little bit more fiscal headroom. And I think if it was tabled and justified properly, then I think that would be accepted by the bond markets. And then the third thing I think we have to do is we have to consider whether the net zero goals that we have are too accelerated. We're risking 200,000 highly skilled jobs in the North Sea. We are less than 1% of global emissions as a country. And why should we be moving at a faster pace and rate than other developed economies? We've got to actually be in line with them, which you can see today in our car industry, 800,000 people here. Us moving at a faster pace is just ludicrous. It's a global business, and we need to move at the pace of the industry, not at the pace that we're artificially setting. So those three things for me would give a little bit of fiscal headroom, give a bit more budget to spend, and allow for some more growth around net zero.
Sounds good. So, Nimesh?
I don't know how I follow that now. From a pure tax standpoint, it was hugely disappointing that we didn't get more of a commitment from Rachel Reeves and the government at the spring statement around the damage some of these policies have caused, in particular the BPR, APR rules, and I would throw in also the non-dom rules as well. It was kind of wishful thinking that Rachel Reeves would have stood up and said, actually, let's just have a pause. I would have loved her to have had a pause almost this time last year when they just came into power to say, gee, we don't need to do anything. At that point, inflation was coming down, tax receipts had been record levels. Let's just listen. First 100 days, that didn't happen. And it's fine to admit that you got it wrong, and sadly that didn't happen at all. I think you need a longer term tax roadmap. We're getting a little bit of that with the business tax roadmap, but as I said before, that strategic direction on tax policy just isn't there. It's all very, very disjointed. So it's really wishful thinking around whether you would get a complete backtrack on some of these very damaging economic policies. And I agree with Steve, you need to look at, I'm not going to make any friends here with pensioners certainly, but you do need to look at the pensions triple lock. Fuel duty is just nonsensical as to why that's been frozen for so long. And I think you also need to look at income tax, national insurance and VAT. Steve, you're right, 75% of our taxes are raised through those big taxes. Why are we trying to do this with both arms actually tied behind our back? Those are the big levers to pull if we need to raise tax revenue. But those fiscal rules need to be looked at in conjunction with the tax policy. My worry is that the government are going to have to come back and ask for more money, but where do you get it from now? Because you've done a lot of the big things on wealth taxes, capital taxes. Are you going to start designing new taxes on the wealthy to generate even more revenue? And again, I fear that that's just going to be even more damaging as well, where you've got something where you could draw down on pretty quickly. So my advice would be, let's go back to the drawing board. There's still time in this parliament to reset on where we are, and let's come up with a proper plan, not only for the next 5 years, but over the next decade, on what we need to do with proper tax policy. The last bullet in the OBR executive summary, I've got rather boring reading these things when they come through now. Yeah. The last bullet said if we sustain the current rate of growth, which we all know is low at 1%, and that's probably not realistic, but by 2070, our debt to GDP will be 270%. So the simple issue is that the state is too big, the provision of services, the expectation is too high, and we need to fundamentally shift the mindset of the public, the population, towards expecting less from the services. We can't afford it. It's not a UK issue. This is a global issue. US running a 6% deficit in the coming year. So the world is unfortunately in an unsustainable trajectory. So those issues are very difficult to break. Ideally, we need cross-party support on certain issues like
social services, the health service. How do they get reformed in an environment where the country can afford that in the long term? But I think that's really wishful thinking, because cross-party support doesn't really happen. But unfortunately, the government's in a difficult spot. And the worst thing they can do, you referred to wealth tax earlier, the worst thing they could do, I think, is bring in wealth tax. That's singularly failed in every single country it's been brought into. And where it has succeeded in places like Switzerland, they have a very, very different tax regime and overall a net lower tax take. So I think changes, from the backbenches that are being pushed through on wealth tax really should concern all of us, and certainly we'll be fighting hard against those.
So overall, do you feel hopeful for the future?
I am a great believer in an environment where unless the government's really doing harsh things to you, you can succeed. So that's a case of trying. It's a case of being brave. It's a case of making some right decisions, having some foresight. And if you do all those things in business and have energy, I think, Jeremy, you succeed. And certainly I'm looking at an environment today where there's plenty of growth opportunity. You've just got to go and find it.
Fantastic. Well, I feel a lot more positive now, having spoken to the both of you. Thank you. That's all we've got time for today. And thank you so much for both your insights. I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
Great. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. And if there's anything in the discussion today that resonates with you as a business owner or your family business, then please feel free to reach out to me or your usual Blick Rothenberg contact.